Hey investors, Bradley here from Watson Estates, and you're listening to the largest, fastest growing podcast for Toronto real estate on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. We like to stay in the news, stay in the know with what's going on in the GTA and real estate and all that fun stuff. We like to have investors on occasionally. Well, today's a special episode. I've really been itching to have someone speak on behalf of landlords and someone speak on behalf of tenants. Well, today we're going to do the landlord side. I'm speaking to Kayla Andrade. She's the founder of Ontario Landlords Watch, property manager at Boardwalk Property Management, national ambassador to Landlord Credit Bureau. She's a landlord in KWC and also the admin for the Ontario Landlords Watch members group on Facebook. Today, we talk about some of the regulations that are in place. We talked about the Residential Tenancy Act, the Landlord and Tenant Board, and the systems. How are they broken? What kind of solutions should be in place in order to help the landlord, but also to help the tenant? I loved having this conversation with Kayla because I found she truly does speak on topics that are oftentimes pushed to the wayside. It's in some ways taboo to speak or to be in favor of the landlord. Well, she absolutely is, and she's not afraid to talk about it. So I had a great conversation with her today. I know you're going to love it. If you could, please share this, especially if you learned some stuff on your Instagram. You can tag us at Watson Estates. Enjoy the show. Kayla, thank you for joining us on the show. How you doing?
Good. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I am also very excited to be here. We get a lot of investors. We have a lot of listeners who are investors, so it's nice to be able to relate. And I know yourself, you are an investor, but I want to take this in a completely different direction than any of the other shows we've done and speak to some of the regulations, some of the challenges we have in housing, because you are intertwined in that world. You're deep. You've been doing it for years. Could you just introduce yourself to our guests? Maybe tell us some of your kind of titles, but also what you do on a day-to-day and how you've gotten where you are today.
Yeah, so title-wise, so I am a landlord, a mother of four. Got to put that in the title. I'm a property manager, and I'm also the national ambassador to Landlord Credit Bureau. And most importantly, I'm the founder of Ontario Landlords Watch, which is an advocacy group for landlords. Getting into how I got into it. So in 2010, my husband and I had some semi, a fiveplex, and we were approached by a city councilor who was telling us that we were going to be responsible for our tenants' delinquent utility bill. So I knew it wasn't right. I knew it was unjust, and I knew we had to stop it because we bought this property individually metered for our retirement plan. Well, as we find out that there was this bylaw that was coming in that would force landlords to pay for the tenants' delinquent utility bills, we start to get very familiar with municipal policies and bylaws and realizing that we have a lot of issues on a municipal level, but also at the provincial level. We created this petition that went all over Ontario, and it came back with so much support and love, and it would come back with messages. Thank you so much for doing what you're doing. Could you help us fight the Residential and Tenancy Act and the Landlord and Tenant Board? And at that time, I was still a new investor myself. And I was like, whoa, what are you talking about? What is the RTA? So we got to work and we realized there is a lot of problems in the housing industry with respects to the Residential and Tenancy Act and the Landlord and Tenant Board. And my job as the housing advocate is to bring all landlords together into a Facebook group where we can discuss the issues and most importantly, think of the solutions and also recommend different products or services that can help us be better landlords and be better tenants in Ontario. But we have a lot of work to do still.
Yeah, I can tell you got a lot of heart behind this, right? Like it's driven by doing what's right. What is the name of the Facebook group so people can join if they're a landlord themselves?
So it'll be Ontario Landlords Watch members. It's free to be a member. Just put in that where you listen to us, that you found us on Bradley's podcast, and that way we can let you in a little bit quicker into the group. And hopefully you're on the same mission as us, is to create a fair and balanced housing system that protects good landlords, good tenants, and taxpayers.
Yeah. And for our audience members as well, I personally believe when I'm sitting back and we're looking at what kind of guests we want on our show, I believe there's a very loud voice from the tenant groups, which I think is fantastic. I think it's great. And I also would like to have more tenant advocacy groups come on the show as well. But I do tend to find the voice for landlords to be lacking. And so that's why I'm excited to kind of start having a conversation with you and seeing what are some of those, common challenges and what progress is being made with the RTA, if any at all. Like I'm curious, maybe to put that one to bed, the issue with delinquencies. Was there any solution to that, or how did things evolve from there?
Well, right off the bat, we want to talk about, what is the number one application of the Landlord and Tenant Board? And the number one application of the Landlord and Tenant Board is non-payment rent. With over 80,000 applications that are brought to the board from a 2018-2019 stats, we had 73,000 of those applications that were landlord applications. And the number one application was the non-payment rent. So now with the pandemic has came about, and we have had certain politicians coming out and really exercising, it's about paying rent or putting food on the table. They encourage you to put food on the table. Even though we do have different type of government support out there for tenants for rent relief, and it's going to be up to the government and staff in order to allow these tenants to get approved for these type of funds. And then we have the concept that we have many tenants who don't care about these programs. They just want to stay into your unit and not pay any rent, and they want to ride it out right up until the sheriff comes. So even with the Residential and Tenancy Act and what we can go through there, and how it's very geared towards protecting the tenants and not giving any rights or protection to landlords, we do have a huge problem at the Landlord and Tenant Board. So as I've been advocating for all these years, we start to see that yes, the RTA is unfair. Yes, it's going to take us a long time to deal with politicians. And of course, we have another election coming from a federal stance. So it's going to be really hard for us to keep that momentum going, because by the time you get through their gatekeepers and you get to the right people, boom, they're changed. So we know that the majority of our problems are at the Landlord and Tenant Board, in which we are happy to say that we get to take part in stakeholder meetings with the Landlord and Tenant Board to find out what changes they plan to make and how we can give them better recommendations. And they have had this big, wide open doors policy where they want us to, talk with them and give solutions. But I want any landlord who's experiencing any type of delays at the Landlord and Tenant Board, I really want them to be able to go ahead and contact the Ontario Ombudsman to make a formal complaint, because they are actively investigating the Social Justice Tribunal because of the lack of delay, of the lack of support, the delays within the system. And we need to have a better operating system, because access delayed is access denied. So we are really working hard to get a speedier way of having our disputes dealt with at the Landlord and Tenant Board. And number one is obviously the non-payment of rent.
Well, it's nice to hear I guess it's kind of good and bad, right? It's good that hopefully voices are being heard. Whether they're applied is different. I wonder if it's the strength of the wording of the Residential Tenancy Act is what forces the landlord to be the one that drives home the complaints. Like when I look at other provinces, it doesn't, I would suspect, I haven't looked at the numbers, but I would suspect it wouldn't be nearly the same volume of complaints for delinquent payments, because you can kind of deal with it at your own level. Are there what are some other major housing issues that you're kind of seeing right now? I do want to kind of stay on some common things. I want to almost let you speak. I want to get to know what are some of the things, the conversations that are having with government and within these groups.
So right now we see a mass exodus, and we see a lot of landlords wanting to leave the industry, especially through the pandemic and what has happened. So we're seeing a lot of landlords leaving. We do see a lot of support coming from, many different elected officials now using housing as a campaign topic in order to gain traction. And that's great. And that's why every investor in Ontario needs to be taking very careful listening ears on to listen what these elected officials are stating as their platform for affordable housing. I come on very, very vocal and would inform them that we have a housing crisis, and it's getting worse throughout the years. Even with more government involvement, it's getting worse. So what we really have to try to exercise is that we have 4 levels of government. We have the federal, the provincial, regional, and municipal government, and they all have their help in play for the actual. My kids are there for the actual. Good golly, why aren't they in school? So that's another topic, guys. So now we're going to be in 4 levels of government who are all having their hands in the cookie jar, and we see a lot of mismanagement of funds and mismanaging of the overall system. And I think that's where we have to unify this voice of housing and the housing needs, is by putting ourselves into that. So landlords who are dealing with, tenants who are ruining the enjoyment of others. Right now our elected officials are really encouraging landlords to say, hey, we want you to be a part of this program. We want to put you on us as the city as a head lease, and we want you to open up your unit to us to be able to house people who are in desperate need of housing. And so many landlords want to do it, but these programs are not there. They weren't created with the mindset of protecting both landlords and tenants. And until they change that, we can't see that program being a program that is going to be a solution in order to help to deal with the housing crisis. So we really have to sit back and tell our elected officials that, one, we need some more incentives. We need to know these type of incentives, and we want to have the small mom and pop landlords to be a part of that. Because if we don't, we are going to see more of a housing crisis, and the landlords, we pay for it. You probably think like, hey, it's a housing crisis. We get to put whatever type of dollar we want for our rental property, and we get it. We look at what we have to pay now as taxpayers when we have to build supportive housing, when we have to build government housing, when we have to pay for the homelessness problems of cleaning up encampments and being able to have fire departments and police services. And our overflow of shelters and the costs, because taxpayers are paying $3,000 a month to house one person in a motel. So you get to see how small landlords are that solution to creating affordable housing. If we have ourselves in a duplex or a single family home, and we have that older population that used to downsize and used to move, now they're not moving. The market is so crazy, they're not moving. Well, let's convince them or encourage them to be small landlords. Let's make it easy for them to turn their basement into an affordable unit. But when they look at what it's like to be a landlord in Ontario, they're running with their tail tucked between their legs. And they're like, no, there's no rights. These tenants can stay for a long, long time. The landlord and tenant board does not help me with my difficult tenant. So they stay away from it. And so this is what their problem is that's their solution, is to work for private landlords. Private landlords are telling the government, no, we're not working with you because of the landlord and tenant board, because of the RTA. And that's why I've made it a mission now for myself, as this election on a federal level is going on, to be as vocal as I possibly can, to let them know that the small landlords have had enough. And because of that, unfortunately, our good tenants are suffering and unable to find the supply. And we're really concerned with the amount of people that are going to be coming into Ontario. And we got no housing. We have no housing for them. So it's definitely an issue that we're seeing as the landlord and tenant board is a huge barrier for landlords in Ontario. And we have to get that to be operating as quickly as possible so that it gives access to justice. And I have to admit, they've taken their 12-month hearing date. You usually had to wait 12 months before you got a hearing date. We're now down to about three months. They have stated that they are expecting to have the hearing dates from 4 to 6 weeks by the end of the year. But what we're seeing is, great, you're having a hearing date, but if you have certain situations in the hearing that are, the tenants are lying or manipulating the situation, or you have an adjudicator trying to feed the tenant perfect wording in order for them to exercise those words in order to get the hearing adjourned. And now we have to wait again to come back at a hearing date. So there's lots of problems that our landlords are having. And I've never seen it before in all the years of me, over 10 years of being a landlord and an advocate, is that we have landlords celebrating that they are getting out of the business. And it's still a really good business to be in. It's still really, but it's the pressure and the chaos that landlords are dealing with that is resulting them to get rid of their single families, their condos, their townhouses, and sell them to a buyer who actually wants to move into it. And those prices are selling well over asking, and those landlords those owners are going to be moving into it and not having it on a rental. So we're actually losing more of our stock.
Interesting. Wow. There's a few holes for you. I definitely see the tendency to vilify the landlord, especially during the closures. It's like, we're going to let the landlord and tenant deal with it. We're not going to get involved. We're not going to come to the help of whether that's through monetarily supporting tenants and those types of things, which really with an RTA like we have put the pressure on the landlord. The landlord ends up being the bad guy. They end up being the one that's to blame if you can't. I mean, yeah, you got all these costs, but so does the tenant, and the tenant's costs in this scenario tend to be more important. But then I also see what you're talking about, the different levels of government, right? I see whether that's through an election or otherwise, we see different levels of government. Maybe could that be just by nature of the city of Toronto having its own unique issues than other parts of Ontario, or Ontario versus other parts of Canada? Or do you see a system where you can actually have some level of consistency or conversation, or do we put that pressure onto one level of government rather than allowing all three to just freely pick and choose on what policies make sense at the time? How do you see that system unfolding that could work?
You need one level of government being able to take this, because what's happening, you got the federal government passing funds to the provincial government, provincial passes it to the region. There's such confusion and contracts, like their jobs, and when they have planners, their contract. So what's happening is by the time that they get planning and doing their job, they're out and into another section of the city doing their job. So there's a major disconnect. There's a broken chain. So if we've had ourselves understanding that we had, the provincial government, they could do one thing that's like really, really good. And then you have the municipal government who is introducing licensing and water billing and really hammering the student rentals on landlord licensing, which is really crappy, because what you're doing is causing the rents to increase in that area because of the landlord licensing. It's a business and the numbers need to make sense. So if we've had ourselves even a rental housing bureau, having it handled by one government where they know exactly how many landlords are in that area in order to be able to know if they can service the needs of the tenants in that area and know where they need to build or where they need to encourage more rental properties. We also can have that an overall central system where we have people with mental health or addiction, or if you have people just looking for affordable housing, they need a one-stop shop. It's such a complicated system to help people with their housing needs that if you had that one-stop shop for them to get all the information and the education that they need in order to understand the different type of services and programs out there to help tenants, this could also be another avenue by having that one level. But again, we want to make sure that they're not playing tug of war with each other, and that's what's happening. One is going to do one thing to think it's a great way to encourage investments, and then the municipalities come in and say, wow, this is a great way to get some money, we're doing landlord licensing. But in reality, it is really discouraging landlords from investing into that city, and they're not, obviously developers not going to be wanting to come in and say, hey, I want to build on your city and I'm going to give you 5 affordable housing units out of 200. This is the concept. This is what they're experiencing. They can't understand why developers are not able to come in and build affordable when they put them through all the red tape and the ringer, and obviously years before they can even get shovels into the ground.
So let me grapple on that one idea that you just had, where we have a central location for people looking for affordable housing going. Do we see that in other cities around the world? What does that system look like? Like if I'm a small time investor, see, the problem I find is in order to buy into government programs, you sell your soul a little bit. You're required to keep your rent rates at certain levels, which are way below, like they're unimaginable. And so what would that system, how would you intertwine and keep things convenient and consistent for the small time landlord, but also a platform where now as a small time landlord, I prefer to find someone that's looking for an affordable unit rather than looking at someone that's a little higher risk or someone that's not worth my time. How would that work?
That's where we have to look at the landlord and tenant board and landlords and their supply, but also look at the way the government is running their own government housing. I've known people in government housing. We see a lot of people in government housing, and we want to look at the type of people who are in government housing, because right now we can say that landlords are private investors. We're not able to, accommodate and be social workers to many people with more complex issues, and that's what's happening. There's a lot of discriminating, and that is happening across the rental industry because of the concept that people on OW and ODSP, those wages are not garnishable. So landlords are looking for tenants who are having garnishable wages. So what do we have to do to encourage that supply and also encourage landlords to want to take people on OW and ODSP? I have people on OW and ODSP. They're great tenants, but you do have many that are just not good tenants. And that puts a very sour taste in that landlord's mouth, where they stay away and they tell elected officials and staff, sorry, I would like to help you, but I don't want to take anybody on OW or DSP. So we really want to get back into creating that supply. And in order to create the supply, in order to look at how the government is allowing people and what the qualifications and requirements to allow people in government housing, we have to make that balance, because we see a very much of a desperate need for supportive housing versus, affordable and supportive. We have too many different chapters and titles, and we got to say, here's housing. Here's housing, here's the support, this is where we go. And sadly, we have ourselves into a central location. We don't know who all the landlords are. We don't know how many rental units are within that city. We know we have more people needing them, but we do need to have a concept of creating the supply, but knowing what area do you give that supply. So it's more data that is going to be able to tell them a deeper understanding of what their needs are for that community. But we do need to have something central, and it needs to be about creating that supply and demand. But you're right, like no one is going to sign up for these programs until we get the landlord and tenant board ready to go, and the RTA, and they're not even going to want to create a unit until we get the landlord and tenant board in tip-top shape, and we have the RTA where we have elected officials actually listening to us.
Yeah. So I think this is a good point of the show to now say, guys, now you see why I brought Kayla on. I think this is stuff you don't hear. This is conversations that aren't happening, unfortunately. And also, just to encourage anyone that has comments, you can reach out to Kayla directly, leave them in wherever you're finding this episode, and continue that conversation, get involved in some of these Facebook groups and dialogue. I want you to just keep going, and I want to ask you what your thoughts are on the Residential Tenancy Act as we see it today. What are some of the highlights that stick out to you as someone that speaks on behalf of landlords?
I think it's broken. It's broken on the concept of, let's say, the standard lease. You have the standard lease that was implemented. It's been now updated. So you now need to make sure you have an updated version. Does it include everything that landlords need and tenants need? No. Can you add additional addendums onto the standard lease? Yes. Then why are we working ourselves in with a standard lease, besides the concept that it gives a lot of different rules and regulations and support for both parties on the last 6 or 7 pages of the standard lease? I do feel that it was created when Kathleen Wynne was involved with it, because they want to keep track of the rents. And if they were able to have a standard lease and show that the rental rate based on that year, that it would eventually be a part of, hey, you've got a tenancy, you have to, submit your new lease, so that we can keep track on what your rental increase is for that in particular unit. Because every politician right now would love full rent control, a lot less, but instead, Doug Ford has created a platform where he said any new buildings built after, or any new units built after 2018, no rent control. But that's not going to stop them. That's not going to stop them and say, hey guys, breaking news, anyone who did do it, it's now underneath rent control. And even with the rent control of 2.5%, and the one concept with Bill 184 is that if you were trying to give a rent increase to your tenant and you didn't do it on the N1 application, then the tenant can come back at you and say, I want all my money back because you didn't give it to me on a proper form. Now with Bill 184, it says, one, you don't need that, it's not so crucial on the N1 application, but if your tenant is paying that rent increase on time for the last 12 months without disputing it, it becomes the lawful rent. So it's like, so you're telling me if I go up an extra $10 and my tenant pays it on time for the last 12 months without disputes, that becomes the lawful rent. So it honestly just creates more of the shadiness. But what we're really wanting to try and advocate for is that, one, we have multiple different types of rental units in Ontario, from condos to townhouses, single family homes, and apartments. And we have utilities included, and we have utilities that are not included. The utilities are always increasing. It's something that we can't control. As much as we want them to be able to control a cheaper rate for investors in Ontario, so that way we can indeed know our numbers and be able to budget that properly. Instead, it keeps going up. So what landlords are either trying to do is, sub-metering these properties so that they have more of a control. But number two, they're also being cautious on how many people are going to be living in those units because it's now all inclusive. So we do have a concept saying, hey, let's look at each property. If it's a condo, your condo fees are rising, your utilities increase. This is your rent increase for the year. Your utilities are, separate. You're just renting the inside of the house. That's great. This is your rent increase this year. Sadly, we're all painted with the same brush. We have all these rules at a provincial level, and it's all coming down no matter how big as a city is, but they always look at Toronto. All their rules and regulations, it's all about the Toronto level. So with the Residential and Tenancy Act now is that they now have put in, with Bill 184, they now said, okay, any landlord out there who wants to take it over for their own personal use, which is obviously sometimes it's all about the selling so the new owner can move in. If you are caught doing this and it's not lawful, then you're not going to be fined $25,000. You're now going to be fined $50,000. So through a pandemic, these are the kind of changes that they're making is because they already predicted that there's going to be landlords wanting to get out of the industry based on this type of behavior that they were experiencing with the tenants. And even down to a corporation, if a corporation did something kicking people out unlawfully, they're now going to be fined from $100,000 to $250,000. So it's like, great, thank you. Like, I see a lot of support there. These landlords are going to be really encouraged to, keep investing into the industry. And in reality, you just preventing them from wanting to, because I don't want to get into a yearly lease and find out that we're not able to evict someone until that yearly lease is done. So this is really bad for people who just wanted to kind of, they got into some financial hardship. They needed to get out. They got, debt from CRA, and they can't even kick out their tenants. These are the kind of matters that can be, changed just a tad bit, and know that the landlords, we look at investment units as, we have to kick out someone. It's time, it's money. If you're good and you're paying on time, that's what we want. And this is why with rent control and having no rent control, what happens in those cities? Do you see the rents? No, it goes based on what the market can bear. And what it also does, it just informs tenants, you're on notice. I'm going to give you an increase of $200 if you're not being nice with the other tenants here, or you're not, if you're ruining the enjoyment of the landlord. But instead, it's all the rights and right to the tenant, where they can stay in your unit as long as they possibly can. And if they've applied to the divisional court after they lose their landlord and tenant board hearing, they get to stay in that unit until their case is heard at divisional court.
See, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but I also see, and it's hard to not see, the other side to the perspective for tenants, where like when I remember when the standard lease forms came out originally, I thought it was a good thing for landlords, to be honest, because it allowed them to have a document. Some of them didn't, especially for smaller landlords. So I do see the value of having some kind of standardized system. I think it actually lines up with a lot of the other suggestions you had, where you're having some kind of standard process. It's clear. I think the reason that form becomes a problem is because the RTA is a problem. And because the rules in that document are so harsh. So is informing a tenant an issue? I don't think so. I think the issue is the rules that are currently in place. And for that, I agree with a lot of the things you're saying. I do. And even in a government that would be pro landlord, as you've mentioned, the wrist slapping's gotten a lot harder. And I do see that continuing. I mean, but obviously you can, through advocacy groups, you can kind of bring those up. And at the polls, you can bring those up unless every advocate's advocating for the same side, in which case you can't. But let's move on. I'm curious. So you mentioned a little bit about landlord tenant board, people playing the appeal game, people really drawing this out. You've mentioned they've been able to speed a lot of these processes up. How have you seen things are going in the right direction? Do you still think there's a lot of room to grow on the landlord tenant board side?
So much more. We actually have a stakeholder meeting now tomorrow, so I'll keep you in the loop of what happens there, because there is a new case management system that's going to come into play on September 1st. It's going to mimic what happens in BC. And with BC, you have to do a login. So this is going to be a concept where you might be able to keep track on, exactly how many applications are coming through. So you get that with, okay, let's check it out tomorrow, and I'll give you more feedback on what the case management hearing system is going to be all about. But with that, you were able to make some changes to the N12 application. So they're now talk about expedited hearings if your tenant is, causing illegal act or safety. This is something that, normally you'll get your hearing dealt with within 30 days, if that was the case. And now for an N12 application, because so many landlords are at the risk of being held accountable legally because of they're unable to close for their house purchase because the tenants refuse to move out. Yeah. That is now able to be expedited at the landlord and tenant board,
which is fantastic.
As long as we have the buyer stating, I'm not extending it anymore, or the new buyer is going to be homeless, they're always going to poke holes through this as well. So you have to be it's going to be in a desperate situation in which you're going to file for an expedited order at the landlord and tenant board. But there is that listening skill that we've told them at our last meeting that, hey, this is what's happening. We also have Navigated Tribunals Ontario, which you go back into that education piece about the standard lease, which is great. You want to have something that's standard. Obviously, there's got to be more fine tuning to it, but you don't. It's already so many pages. My tenants are like, this is a lot of paper. I'm like, that's the government for you.
Certainly informs the tenant more than the landlord. I would agree with that in the standard lease form. Absolutely. And I think that's where the pressure comes onto the landlord to be the one that you need to know more. You need to be fully informed, because you're not going to get that information until it's too late, until you have a delinquency. And then you're playing catch up because you didn't use the right forms. So
we have Navigate Tribunals Ontario, where the tenants will be able to answer their questions and put their questions, and resources pop up for them, including rent relief, a link to local service managers to give them access to rent relief.
Yeah, there you go. So let's talk. I want to look at it first from the landlord's perspective, then the tenant's perspective. What are some tips for landlords that you have going in when you're looking for a tenant, just to be prepared? And you said yourself, and I totally agree, it's a great time to be a landlord. It truly is, but you got to keep your head up. You got to be aware of what's going on. Changes like the standard lease form, changes are happening all across the board, especially during election time. So what are some tips you'd give for the landlord? And then we're going to jump over. Give me some tips on what you'd say to tenants.
So for landlords, it's making sure that you're not making rush decisions. You have to make sure, one, that your rental unit is up to par with what your unit has to offer, not but what you're looking for as a tenant, looking for in a tenant. Once you're putting in that you're doing credit checks, reference checks, and tenancy searches with Landlord Credit Bureau, this is also going to bring the concept to the tenants that you are serious and that you are going to do a full check on them, and making sure that you have the information available to them, and giving them the standard lease and then walking them through it so that they understand your rates as well. So many professional tenants, as we would call them, they look for landlords who are not diverse into the Residential and Tenancy Act of Landlord and Tenant Board. So definitely go in there with caution and pride, and making sure that you're doing your social media checks. Definitely checking people out on social media and getting them talking as a person, and understand that everyone has a situation, and just because they have bad credit doesn't mean that they don't pay their rent on time. So this is going to be something where you just have to really take your time and interview your tenant in order to make sure that it's a right fit for you and it's a right fit for the other tenants in the property. But making sure that you are telling your tenants, this is the game changer. This is why I wanted to be able to voice and be a part of this, is that the Landlord Credit Bureau, you're allowing landlords and property managers to report your tenant's monthly payment history to Landlord Credit Bureau. So this is something where it is going to inform the tenants that payment of rent is needed on time every single month. You do not need a judgment. You do not need their consent in order to report the debt to the Landlord Credit Bureau, in which goes to Equifax. But for your good tenants that you're trying to appeal to, this is going to help them and want to take your unit, because you can also do the opposite, which you can help grow their credit by reporting their monthly payment history. And this is going to give them an inch closer to becoming homeowners themselves by paying rent, and how much you pay for rent. They're going to be able to grow their history with that. So that is where you want to, really exercise in screening, because even though we have the RTA and the LTB as broken as it is, as long as you get your screening process and you are doing customer service and you are providing the maintenance like no one's business, you will make it out fine. We'll be fine.
Gold. I agree. All of those things. And that's a new program too. I think that's really going to be helpful. Okay. Tenants. What would you advise tenants? Because I think a lot of people think, oh, it's a pro advocate for a landlord on the show. They hate tenants. That's not at all the case. You said a few times, a lot of these systems being corrected are to the benefit of good tenants. It actually keeps people responsible, or it has some accountability. What would you say to tenants given all of these things?
Tenants, if you're out there and you're looking for a rental unit, you have your ways to shine. Right away from you responding to that first ad on Facebook to inquire about this rental unit, come across very professional with it. Tell them a little bit about yourselves. Book that appointment. Don't be late. It's not something where, their time is just as valuable, and you showing up on time really shows that you are professional in a way that you are going to respect their time. Manager, get your rental application together. You should know your numbers, your birth date, your income and your job and your old landlord. Have it filled out, and have it filled out nicely and neatly in order to present that to your landlord. Now, if you want to go a little bit extra and beyond, which I've been it was a thrill to see it coming from tenants, is that you're getting a personalized letter about you, and one pager, just tell them about your life, getting to know them, because this is a relationship. It's a business relationship that you're doing. So giving them that information is definitely going to put your application at the top of that application pile. And we also have to come in with all your documents. Get your photo ID ready, get your bank statements ready, get your credit check ready, even though the landlord's going to do his own credit check, and getting all your references from landlords, any from document in a nice binder ready to go, and being able to be delivered to your landlord and say, it would be a pleasure if you got to pick me as to be your candidate. And even to be the concept of landlord credit bureau again. Tenants, sign up yourself. You can sign up. You can have your landlord, invite your landlord to report your monthly payment history. Your previous landlord can give you a review. That review can now be shared with your new potential landlord. And this is what's going to be, whoa, you have your own account. This is the game changer. This is how we get you in there. And making sure that you're understanding to a landlord if they have any type of maintenance issue once you're in there. Again, deal with it in a very professional manner, be calm, be understanding. And remember, most of these landlords have full-time jobs. So it's not like they can come and drop what they're doing, or there's a delay within services of contractors. And when heaven knows there's a limited supply of contractors in Ontario, it seems like, and it's going to take some time to get it done. But be understanding, be respectful, and understand when you live in multi-families that you will hear noise and you will have fights with your neighbors. But this is when you have to be an adult and understand that sometimes it's nice to be good with neighbors and you want to be best friends, but you got to live there. Sometimes just wave, don't go out for dinner and have a whole bunch of drinks together. But that's the concept of usually the fights and the disputes that will come into play afterwards. But there's many opportunities for our tenants now to still shine in this market. Right now, we're just trying to be that group to help you by promoting that supply. And in order to promote that supply, we have to encourage changes within the system that do work for good landlords, good tenants, and taxpayers.
Totally agree. Okay, last question. We're going to keep this one quick because I'm going to wrap it up here. I want you to be able to share where people can find you. But an election is about to break out here. How do you think housing, or what do you think is going to be up on the table? What are some of the big topics as it relates to housing that we're going to be able to see in the next few weeks leading up to September?
Definitely waiting for all of them to come out with all their platforms. I know that the Conservatives have came out regarding the ban on foreign investments. They're also looking for different incentives in order to create better incentives to encourage that more supply. And that's where my money's going to lie right now. It would be with the Conservatives. We've seen what the Liberals have done, and just throwing, I think Jagmeet Singh, he wanted an extra some money towards the rent. It's like, but the rents have gone up. Like, it's great you have money towards rent, but we need supply. And that's where I think the Conservatives are nailing it right on the noggin and saying we need to get that supply up. And what do we have to do it if we, as the government and the taxpayers, can't afford or have the time to build government housing?
Beautiful. Okay, Kayla, tell us where people can find you and get involved. Maybe if they want to reach out to you, how are people best to do that?
So you can find me on Facebook, Ontario Landlords Watch members. We have our Ontario Landlords Watch public page, and we also have me on Kayla Andrade. You can send me a friend request. I'll be more than happy to accept your friend request if you love real estate like I do. And I'm also on Instagram, and we dabble a little bit on YouTube just to keep you in tune to our interviews that we do with our landlords, because it's about getting the voices of our landlords and our property managers and realtors and even tenants out there in order to create that balance system.
I think this interview absolutely delivered. And if you guys do as well, please support the channel, hit the like button, share this as well on Instagram. You can tag us at Watson Estates. And if you have any questions for Kayla, feel free to leave those wherever you want. Kayla's obviously very available and willing to support people and the real estate community as well. So thank you, Kayla. Appreciate you taking the time today, and we'll see you again soon, I think.
Thank you so much, Bradley.